Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's live stream. My name is John. I am the tattooed historian. Great to be back here again with my great friend Pete Carmichael, director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. How are we doing tonight, Pete?
I'm doing fine, John.
Great.
I complimented you when we weren't on air. I will compliment you now that we're live. I love the shirt.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I figured
Yeah.
I'd cover up since you got me on tattoos last time. I would put the long sleeves on tonight.
Someone sent me an email and they said they liked that and seriously, they said that they appreciated that question because they think, because every tattoo, according to this person, has its own story.
Oh yeah, for a lot of people.
I always assumed that most of the stories were, I got crazy drunk and did this, right?
Yeah, I don't have any of those.
Yeah. Luskey, what about you, Brian? Any tattoos yet?
Zero tattoos.
You're waiting for your midlife crisis to do that, right?
He's waiting for his gift certificate to Pickett's from us.
That's right. Shop. So tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Brian Luskey. Brian was a colleague of mine at West Virginia University, where he still is. He's an associate professor, and with the publication of this book, Men is Cheap, he will be, I suspect, a full professor this time next year, or at least he should be. And so tonight we'll talk a little bit about Brian's book, of course, and I should note, published by University of North Carolina Press. And as all of our viewers know, UNC Press has been kind enough to give a special discount to all of our viewers, a whopping 40% off, which is substantial. I think probably almost better than what Brian could get for his own book. Brian, you need to take advantage of this offer, right?
Yeah,
so, I already have.
You already have. Let's keep that economy going, and I think buying books is a good thing. Whether we're in the middle of a pandemic or not. So once again, we'll talk some more about Brian. But I want to give you a little of Brian's background. Brian spent his formative years in Maryland, and I believe his house, which was part of a development, but that development was on the land owned by Isaac Trimble. Did I get that right, Brian? Or
right.
An important little fun fact. Brian did his undergrad at Davidson College in North Carolina. And when we're done, John, Brian's going to be shy about this, but we'll just have to coax it out of him.
Yeah.
Brian Luskey, graduate of Davidson. And John, you don't strike me as a big sports fan. Am I wrong about that?
I'm a baseball guy. That's about it.
That's not a sport. Okay.
I like curling. Is curling fine?
Okay, I'll go with that. Well, Davidson is noted for being a very fine academic institution and a beautiful campus. It's the home of Seth Curry, who is a sharpshooting guard who plays for the Warriors. Of course, Brian Luskey, again, he'll have to tell us the details at the end of all this. He beat Seth Curry at horse.
You got that's impossible, of course, because he's much younger than I am. And it's
that's how you beat him.
It's Steph Curry, not Seth Curry.
What is it?
His brother's name is Seth.
Oh, it's not the brother
Steph Curry. Yeah. Yeah, just not as good a basketball player.
Well, he's still an NBA player. That's okay that you beat his brother.
That's true. Yeah. I'll give you that.
And Brian, you should never let facts get in the way of a good story. I mean, that's rule number one for the historian, is it not?
Yeah, print the legend.
Print the legend. That's what people want.
Yeah.
So Brian resides actually in Gettysburg, so he obviously does the commute. In fact, he's essentially a neighbor of mine. And as the crow flies, he's a mile away up on her ridge. So Brian's in the neighborhood, the gated community, up on the high ground, right? And I'm in the valley. And I would also note that Carol Reardon, she's also in Brian's neighborhood. So all the distinguished historians, they're over there. Man. And I'm with the people, John, and that shouldn't surprise you.
I'm not even allowed in the same town, so that's okay.
Well, to get you in. So yes, so Brian's a neighbor as well. Brian and I, we love to trade power tools. We like to talk about mulch. Brian's favorite mulch is birch, I believe. I prefer pine. We're like regular suburban warriors, are we not, Brian?
We haven't seen each other for like 3 months.
Well, that's not my problem.
We got a pandemic
This
going
is
on,
like the
Brian.
first time.
It is, but I have insisted, Brian, we can go on the battlefield and keep our distance, but we'll work on that off air.
Yeah,
We'll figure it out somehow.
we'll give it a shot.
So I should also note that Brian's teammate or wife is Ashley Luskey. Ashley Luskey, as many of you know, is the assistant director at CWI. She is largely responsible for the conference that we put on every year. And so she's indispensable to what we do at the Civil War Institute. And I suspect, I know for a fact, she's been a big part of your own work, right? Read your work, listens to you, your ideas, and the back and forth. I mean, I'm serious. It's really important. I mean, Beth, my teammate, she plays a critical role in all that. It's nice to have, well, you have a historian in your household. I have an archivist in mine. So enough of that background.
Yeah.
I apologize if I got any of those details right. So now, which Curry did you beat? It's not Seth. Which one did you beat?
I once threw an alley-oop in a pickup game to a Davidson player, but he's not one you're gonna know. So that was pretty cool. That was like a highlight of my
there you go
athletic career.
My claim to fame, mine is in 4th grade. This kid threw my shot so far across the playground. I mean, threw it. And his dad went on. His dad played for the Pacers.
Wow.
I'll get to the punchline to this. It was the NCAA tournament, and I hadn't, for some reason, really been following basketball much. And this guy came on, and I said, hell, I know him. And my friends are like, man, shut the hell up. I said, that's Danny Manning. I said, he blocked my shot in 4th grade. He just got fired by playing sports, by the way. But one of the great college basketball players of all time.
Yeah, sure.
He showed me at an early age that basketball was probably not going to be my sport. All right, so we'll get back again to Brian's book, Men is Cheap. Men is Cheap. It's an outstanding piece of scholarship. And I think one of the things that Brian and I have talked a great deal about this is the subtitle, Exposing Frauds of Free Labor in Civil War America. And I think that for our audience, they're thinking, what's free labor mean? Because, all of us have had bad jobs at some point, right? There's no such thing as free labor, right? That doesn't make any sense. So Brian, could you at least help us understand, what do you mean? What do scholars mean by free labor?
Thanks, guys, for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this book with you, and certainly that's an important question to start with. It's a question that my students, even after having me teach the concept to them, they still have some trouble understanding. Free labor ideology came together as a set of ideas most clearly in the 1850s around a new political party, the Republican Party. And what the ideas at the heart of this ideology proposed was that wage labor, as it existed in northern states, was a superior economic and social system to southern slavery. It was a system in its ideal form that allowed workers the opportunity to make a contract with the employer of their choice, and to save their earnings to become independent. And this was something, of course, that was not available to enslaved people in the southern states. It's part of an attempt to rehabilitate wage labor, which many white northern workers in earlier decades, in the kind of the rolling out of industrialization, a process that changed labor and the ability of workers to advance in northern society. Some of those workers referred to wage labor as wage slavery in an effort to combat the detrimental effects of industrialization that brought them into competition with a wider variety of other workers, immigrant workers, women, and even children. So this was an argument that white workers in the North used to try to highlight their predicament. The fact that wage labor from their perspective meant that they were dependent. These are the dependence and independence, of course, are important political keywords of the pre-Civil War era, if not throughout American history. They're at the very heart of understandings of citizenship and in many cases what it meant to be men. So by the 1850s, though, with the encroachment of the political power, the slave power, the Republicans kind of coalesced in opposition to, this was an effort to try to privilege the rights of Northern white men to be able to move west onto free territory in order to, become independent landholders and employers of labor there, and in competition with a system of slavery, which would tend to make white Northerners dependent if they had to compete with it.
Brian, very quickly, tell us how Abe Lincoln epitomizes the aspiration of free labor.
Sure. Lincoln very often talked about his what we might think of in reference to the novels of Horatio Alger, a rags to riches story, or at least rags to independence. He talked about his time as a rail splitter, mauling rails, doing difficult manual labor, and his rise through saving and through education, through perseverance and hard work. He became a respectable gentleman lawyer. And so he and his many of his followers pointed to Lincoln as a quintessential sort of example of the promise of free labor. And Lincoln proposed that this was a three-step process. He believed that waged workers were never in the North, within the system of free labor, fixed to their condition as enslaved people were. And that was an argument that he made against Southern politicians like South Carolina's James Henry Hammond, who argued that every society and every economy had a mudsill class moored to the floor. And that's why Southern slavery was, in Hammond's mind, superior to wage labor, because what Northern employers did, according to Hammond, was when wage laborers became surplus to requirements, they simply fired them and left them to fend for themselves. I guess I would hasten to say that proponents of both of these economic systems were making a very strong case for themselves because they were in a political struggle with the other, and so they glossed over the injustices, the coercions of their competing economic systems.
And John, before you get your question in here, I just wanted to mention, Brian, we do a lot of show and tell here on this, and I think a book that Brian leans heavily on, we all do, is Eric Foner's Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men. It's his second book, isn't that correct, Brian? Didn't you do it?
I believe it's his first.
Is his first?
Yeah,
biography
the book
on Pain, wasn't that before
that? Was later. That was
okay.
later. I think the book you're holding was published in 1970, and his biography of Paine, Tom Paine in Revolutionary America, is 1976. I think that was his next book.
Thank you for that correction. Yes. Well, at any rate, this is an outstanding book. As many viewers know, Eric Foner, a distinguished career, to say the least. And people mostly know him for his Reconstruction book, which is, I think, mighty fine. But this book, I think more than anything else, helped me understand the idea of political economy. And those are words, as Brian's alluded to, they are words that are difficult, I think, for our students to grapple with. I think they're probably difficult for even general audiences, but as a way of understanding the relationship between ideology, culture, and economics and politics, bringing all those together, the concept of political economy. And in Foner's book, his example obviously is free labor, right? And looking at how free labor functioned in the North, how it shaped attitudes and perceptions of the South, how it also played an integral part, as Brian already alluded to the creation of the Republican Party. And it's a book that I can't say enough good things about. It's free soil, free labor, free land.
So Brian and Pete, a lot of people don't know this, but I have a degree in accounting. So I went to business school, and one of my favorite classes was macroeconomic theory, believe it or not. But when I read your book, I'm like, this is microeconomic theory for the class that I got like a D in. And but the way you presented period, what we would consider period microeconomic theory is very well, done and readable, which I really appreciated because, as I said, I got a D in that class. But the one thing that I really enjoyed with it that I'd like you to touch on is how art was utilized, because after all, people call me the tattooed historian. We should talk about art, and you put it in the book where you talk about posters and for markets and marketing, but then it's used later for the early Civil War days of recruiting.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to touch on that for me a little bit?
Sure. I guess to start, I want to just step back and to say that one of the arguments of my book, and it's in some ways building from Foner, so I just want to return to what Pete was just saying. Foner identifies two contradictory aspects of free labor ideology. On the one hand, it focuses on, as an ideology, on the opportunities available to wage workers to advance to independence. But it also talks about very clearly, and Lincoln was one of these people, there is no kind of opposition to capital within free labor ideology, because one of free labor ideology's freedoms, of course, is for employers to be able to hire workers of their choice. And at the time, people who believed in this ideology believed there was a harmony of interests between laborers and people with capital. They had the same interests, that workers were just capitalists in the making. It seems to me that the story of the war is a story that highlights the ways in which, from the perspective of Northern employers, the war seemed to be an opportunity for them to become more independent by virtue of employing people of their choice. And the war gave them a wider variety of options of who to employ. And we can come back to that. But to your point, John, I want readers to understand that free labor ideology emerged in a culture in the North that valued speculation and ambition. And we can see that, I think, very clearly in the advertisements of the era. Business owners competing with each other in difficult economic times, particularly at the beginning of the war, when Southern debtors increasingly refused to pay off Northern creditors. So the Northern firms who were owed that money were, in the lingo of the time, in panic. And that's the financial panics of the era. I think certainly the secession crisis should join the panics of 1819 and 1837 and 1857 when we talk about economic downturns where credit and capital were scarce and people had to try to figure out ways to survive. But we do see many of these kind of business advertisements with grandiose promises about cheap access to goods, trying to encourage customers to buy. At the time the war began, many of the firms that printed these advertisements would use what were called check ends, the images in the advertisements, and these included depictions of soldiers and officers and the American flag. And these businesses would say you can get access to cheap goods at war prices, or secession cheapens the price of goods. Yeah. So this can work for you even if it's not working for the nation. But those same images printed by the same printing firms in cities like Philadelphia found their way, of course, into recruitment posters. Mm-hmm. And in my way of looking at it, these recruiting ads emerge out of a culture of advertising, which tried to get readers' attention. These were broadsheet advertisements that were sometimes 1.5 to 2 feet by 3 feet in size, and so they were plastered to the side of buildings. You really wanted to get people's attention. And from May of 1861, the federal government was offering a $100 bounty. So we often think of early war recruitment as being totally about volunteerism, about civic virtue, about citizens rallying to the cause of their nation. And of course, that's true. That's very true. But I would argue that it's something of a fool's errand to try to pick apart the political ideology or the reasons why James McPherson's For Cause and Comrades, the motivating factors for recruitment are nearly all ideological, pulling those apart from economic concerns of enlisting men worrying about whether their families are going to be able to survive this while they're gone. And many of these men are taking a pay cut to become a soldier, and so that economic concern was there the whole time. And I don't mean to devalue the ideological reasons to fight. It's just that these economic reasons were also there. And so I think that, to speak to your point, these recruiting posters look like they do in part because they were part of a culture of business and of commerce.
Brian, I'm holding up one from your book right now. I can see it. It was a good example of what you're speaking of, no?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. I've forgotten now which town in Pennsylvania Ramage's store was in. Maybe you could. Well, it's printed in Philadelphia. These were these businesses. This was a small town in central or western PA. But he's the one who touts war prices, right? And it's this image of the soldiers.
The soldiers on there and the flag as well, mixes it all together.
Yeah. And I guess I have to acknowledge my ignorance of whether these advertisements worked. I think what Ramage as a businessman is hoping for is that soldiers will enlist maybe in his store. There were a lot of stores that served as recruiting offices. They would buy goods on their way out, maybe with some of the money they received from enlisting.
Right.
So, Brian, I just want to make a general assessment about your book, and then I'd like for you to, if you have a little bit of pushback to that, that would be great.
Sure.
I hope that would be maybe a way to lead to some of the really powerful stories you have in this book. I think, Brian, what you've done so skillfully is that you have been able to take what I would call micro histories. You've drilled down in the stories of individuals, and they are stories that are compelling, that have a little bit of action and drama to them. But they are stories, and now here's my point. They are stories, Brian, that even though you say, hey, look, reader, I don't want you to think that I believe that the Union soldier in 1861 wasn't ideological. You're saying, reader, the soldier was, and the soldier was idealistic. But Brian, when I read your book, I can't help at times to think, man, this is a dark side of the war, a sordid side of the war. This is a war for patriotism. This is a war for ambition, not for the nation, but ambition for the self. And so This, what you reveal to me and what I think you'll reveal to the readers, is that this Northern War effort, which we now have suddenly put on a pedestal because in this current day in which we live, we have to, of course, smash all things that are Confederate and demonize all things Confederate. I read this book and I think, good God Almighty, where can I find in the Civil War a story in which it is truly uplifting? And I'm hoping that maybe one person that you could speak about is Charles Brewster's letters. And I don't know, again, my big question and one of your, I think, sort of stars in the book, how you might be able to respond to my response or to my reaction to your book.
Sure. How do you define the dark turn, quote unquote? That's a phrase that's been bandied about amongst our colleagues.
Yeah. John, why don't you go first? I mean, I
How do I define the dark turn?
the dark turn.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what Pete's getting at. Is that right, Pete?
Well, I mean, it's maybe in part that way. I mean, I think that, look, I think Reed Mitchell said it well, that Americans in general like bedtime stories when it comes to the Civil War. They want something that is reaffirming about the men who went off to fight for duty, for cause and comrade. And you've said it very well. And I'm not trying to be too difficult here, because it is true that in your book, you acknowledge that idealism and high ideas really did matter. I think when the label dark turn, I think it often impedes our understanding more than anything else. And so I wish those words hadn't slipped out of my mouth. Instead, I would say, Brian, is that what I think you have done and what others have done is you've been able to get beyond the grand narrative of a war in which there are highs and lows, but ultimately we see the cause of liberty being advanced because the men in the ranks of Northern armies, as well as those people back on the home front, though there's dissent and there's disagreement, by and large, they're committed to the Union and they're committed to suppressing the rebellion. And so that grand narrative, right? I feel like others are punching holes in it. I think that's a good thing. Calling it a dark turn, I'm not sure where that gets us. So I think you've punched a hole in this, and it's a little pinhole for us. And I want you now to help us look through that pinhole and tell us how Brewster maybe is one way of understanding that the war wasn't this grand heroic narrative.
Yeah. So I think that while I guess I would say that earlier works, I guess recent scholars who follow this or chart a historiographical change over time and see kind of a different sort of outlook on the war these days than in previous days, point to McPherson's battle cry of freedom and to talk about a struggle that involved suffering, injustice, but an ennobling consequence, emancipation. I mean, I guess what I'd say is certainly those older works talked about those injustices and the great deal of suffering that the war caused. I think maybe, my contribution to a rethinking of the war is to look at the economy, as John said, from the perspective of the middlemen, these labor agents who, in my mind, shaped that economy and some of the outcomes of the war. Very often in economic terms, if you look at a kind of a macroeconomic level, we're talking about huge business firms coming into greater pervasiveness and prominence after the war, like railroads, and they're kind of given the kind of the some of the credit and blame for changing the economy afterwards. In looking at it from this more individual and kind of micro level, right. I want readers to understand that it's not just economic forces that are changing it. It's the actions of ambitious men who try to make the war's transformations work for them. because they believe in free labor ideology and because they believe they're still dependent. They're not independent. They're not as independent as they want to be. All right. So that leads them. I'm kind of more describing this than taking a side. I mean, I obviously think that what they do is pretty lousy.
Right.
I guess if you had to, if
Well,
you had to pin me down on it. But let me just say that they're acting on events like emancipation and thinking of it in ways of how can I become more independent? And it's going to be employing people who have just been emancipated. And it speaks to the point that historians like Chandra Manning and Amy Taylor have made in their books, Manning's Troubled Refuge, Amy Taylor's Embattled Freedom, about the fact that emancipation did not mean freedom, or it didn't mean freedom as we would understand it. And that creates opportunities and closes off opportunities to emancipated people because they have to deal with the ambitious sorts who I talk about in my book, like Charlie Brewster.
So tell us, how did, on the ground, what did Brewster do? How does he become not really an agent of emancipation, but he sees the war as an opportunity to be an agent for himself, right?
Right. Charlie Brewster is from Northampton, Massachusetts. He was a store clerk before the war. You're holding David Blight's great edited collection of his letters that I used at length in this book. And Brewster is one of 4 or 5 characters that I kind of take through the war and to show how they participated in these changes. Brewster joins the 10th Massachusetts. He becomes a junior officer, second lieutenant in one of the forts outside of DC in the first winter of the war. And becoming a junior officer gives him a perk that enlisted men don't have. He can now hire a servant. And Brewster and other junior officers in this area have their pick of fugitive people running away from slavery in Maryland, primarily. And when Brewster hires a young man named David to work with him, he talks about defending David from recapture by his master, who is constantly coming into camp at Camp Brightwood looking for him. But at the same time, David's doing the labor that makes Brewster a gentleman officer. It's the labor that Brewster no longer has to do. And of course, when Brewster says, well, I can't really tell any difference now that I'm an officer from when I was a non-commissioned. I came in as a sergeant, I guess. He said, I can't tell the difference. But in fact, he tells his mother, now I have, I used to have no money and a lot of work, and now I have lots of money and no work.
Right.
So I think that you can see there that the way he understands emancipation, and it's a process that's contested within his own regiment. There are other officers saying, we've got to drive these fugitives back to their masters and be rid of them. And people like Brewster sticking up for these men and trying to explain away their self-interest in the case. Later in the war, Brewster becomes a recruiter of African-American men living in and around Norfolk, Virginia, to serve fulfill the draft quotas for the state of Massachusetts. So by the summer of 1864, the rules of recruitment had changed such that formerly enslaved people in the South could be recruited by agents in the field for northern states to serve for those states' quotas. And it's that kind of rapacious sort of activity, trying to offer good bounties to secure the services of men while you're competing with other states to do so, that Brewster is really importantly involved with. And I think that kind of rapacious, ambitious activity by these Northern entrepreneurs and a great many Northern families back home who want formerly enslaved people to work as domestic servants in their homes, this reflects the kind of the interest of a Northern middle class coming into and trying to make out as best they can during the war by virtue of seizing some of this available labor and vulnerable labor. That helps explain what happened after the war. With the rise of a Freedmen's Bureau that operates an employment agency in Washington and farms out former slaves to Northern households, and to some of the labor conflict and the retreat from Reconstruction that we see in the 1870s. When a lot of white Northern employers turn away from helping formerly enslaved African Americans, in part because they still have a lot of misgivings that laborers aren't obedient enough.
So Brian, real quickly, then I'll turn over to John here. So, but Brian, what you've just described for us in Brewster's case, and then you noted that in fact the recruitment of former slaves into the Union Army, that the practices that were utilized were often coercive or deceptive, and that these other labor agents, which I hope you'll talk about, and how they were able to funnel not just former enslaved labor to the North as domestics, but they also used former or Confederate prisoners as well, right? Trying to find them jobs up North. But Brian, here again, well, I was so struck by this book and also dismayed because I've had over the years, especially when I worked at national parks, have visitors coming to me with a lost cause view of the war. And with that lost cause view of the war, they time and time again say, the USCT regiments composed of men who were often there against their will. And so how, if I were to say to you that this book unintentionally reaffirms some of that lost cause dogma, how do you respond to that?
Pausing. Well, I guess what I'd say is that my argument in part is that white Northerners in the main fought the war to vanquish slavery and the power of slaveholders. That's what I mean by that. So when they said they were fighting for union, in part they were saying they're fighting against the powerful cabal of the most wealthy men in their society who lauded all of the political power over them. I think that, and in fact, you know, to bring up Hammond again, a lot of white Northerners thought, and they took on in kind of an ironic sort of way, the label mudsill for themselves. Charlie Brewster is one of them. At Malvern Hill, he told his family, we were the bone and sinew of the white North, the mudsills mowing down these knightly cavaliers. And you know what people like Brewster wanted was access to the South's resources. Frankly, he talked about with his family about getting the soil down here in Virginia is wonderful. He's not alone in saying that. I want to tell Uncle Edward he ought to move down here, and I'm thinking about getting a farm for myself down here. This is where we can have independence, and that's gonna mean utilizing the labor of former slaves. Now, there's never any doubt in Brewster and other Northerners' mind that they were going to pay wages to these former slaves. But understandings of wage labor during the war were somewhat ambiguous. So I talk a lot about Benjamin Butler and the general who at various moments during the war commanded the Department of Virginia and later the Department of Virginia and North Carolina. In 1863, when he came back to command at the end of 1863, he initiated a plan in which he kind of set the highest wage an African-American man could make at $10, which is a number that you guys and your audience will know as at that point the monthly wage for African-American soldiers. And he did that to funnel men from other, perhaps more remunerative work, which seems hard to believe, but within the quartermaster's department, Black men were making more than that a month. And what Butler was trying to do was to get those men into his armies, in his department. And so there are ways in which commanders could fix the quote unquote promise of wage labor by saying there's a ceiling to what you can make here. And the first people to be upset about that were other employers in his department, who complained to very little effect, actually. Butler got his way, and these men did start to enlist because there were fewer and fewer opportunities for them to do anything else. He says that impressment is not permissible under this general order, but one of his subordinates does that very thing. And so I talk about this subordinate, John Nelson, and how he was trying to recruit the 10th USCT, his regiment, through underhanded means. And I think what that the testimony at his court-martial for having done this, he was brought up on these charges of impressing Black men in the region to serve in his regiment. What I find is that the men who were dragooned at bayonet point into this regiment talked about a mixture of things that reflected the power of the ideological or cultural power of both consent and coercion. So these men would say, when asked, so did you come here of your own accord to enlist? Well, no, this gang of Zouaves came and forced me to, leave my own crops. And it was stunning to me reading some of these sources, that these men were saying they already were independent. They were farming, maybe on government farms, on occupied farms, but feeling some sense of ownership over what they were doing and some independence in what they were doing. And they would ask, well, can't I bring my corn in before I go? Like I'm willing to go, but just on my own clock. They believed that their consent mattered, though. So they'll say things like, yeah, I was made to come here, but I was also obliged to be a soldier. And I think they're just starting to try to figure out how they can conceive of themselves as citizens, which of course we often think of as being about rights. But in fact, it's also about obligation, and they understood that obligation. One guy said, I'm here, and he was forced to come to this camp, and he said, I'm here to fight for my country.
It reminds me though of, Confederate soldiers, non-slave holding Confederate soldiers had that very same conception though, did they not? Of, I have an obligation to my nation, but I also have a sense of duty to my home and to my community. And that community, and that's a kind word, is saying going AWOL, right? Going from army to home, back and forth, is really no different than what many of these USCT volunteers, what their ideas of what duty was.
Yeah, I didn't really answer your question about the lost cause view. I guess I would just say it's complicated. I mean, even in a situation in which men were impressed, they could feel like in some ways that they might want to be there, maybe under different circumstances. And so it's hard to say that. Certainly I would react very strongly against any assertion that these men purely did something that they didn't want to do.
But I think you did answer it, because you made the point they got paid wages. And I think you did answer it because you also made the point that they got to arbitration. It could be a court martial, but there was still some arbitration. It's clear that their status as free people Again, not the freedom that maybe some of us would like for them to have had and what we
Yeah.
often imagine, but I think you make it very clear. It's not slavery. It's not slavery.
It's not slavery. And I guess I would also say, though, that wage labor had its own coercions, which
Absolutely.
were in many ways very substantial. I can tell you another story if you want to hear it about another soldier who was accosted on the streets of Philadelphia, a guy named Aaron Willett. He was 42 years old. He was a laborer, an African-American man, accosted by a white recruiter by the name of Joseph Peck, who offered him passage by train from Philadelphia to New Haven, where Peck said, "You can join my regiment, the 29th Connecticut Colored Infantry, for a $400 bounty. And the state of Connecticut will kick in $6 a month for your wife and $2 a month for each of your kids." And Willett said in a testimony later on, you know something's bad's going to happen, because I know about this through kind of a court-martial testimony. But he said, I couldn't believe that Connecticut would pay someone from another state to serve in one of their regiments. But this was a deal that was too good to pass up. And I guess we should also know that workers were not gullible, but they were looking for bargains. They were looking for opportunities. And no one was ever paid before they did work. So you kind of had to, at least have a modicum of trust with people who offered you jobs. And so he took an overnight train to New Haven, where he was met by another man named Benjamin Pardee, who said he was the colonel of the 29th Connecticut. That was at that time, Peck informed Willett that $20, that the cost of his train trip would have to be forfeited out of his bounty. And Pardee said, "We're only going to pay you $200, not $400. And Willett said, "I ain't doing it. I'm not enlisting for that." Like that was not our bargain. That was not the contract we made back in Philadelphia. And Pardee at that moment says, "Okay, so you're going to get $75 more when you actually muster into the regiment in camp." All right. And I should also tell you right now, Pardee tells Willett, that there are thieves around the camp. And so if you wanted to, if you thought it was a good idea, you could leave your bounty with me for safekeeping. Can you imagine this? You know what's going to happen. So Willett thinks he's talking to his commanding officer.
Right.
And so he says, "Okay, boss, here's $170.
Oh.
And of course, Peck and Pardee are not officers in the 29th Connecticut. They are leading the effort that is sponsored by the state's governor, William Buckingham, to recruit African-American men for Connecticut regiments. So they're still officials of the state, but they're totally misleading the men they're recruiting. And in fact, they also recruited, Connecticut's bounty was actually $300, not $400, but they had to promise Philadelphia men $400 to get them to come with them. In Alexandria, Virginia, they only had to promise men $150. So Pardee had this whole network of agents working for him to bring African-American men north to Connecticut. The court-martial proceedings were initiated by John Dix, who commanded the Department of the East in New York City, and he ruled that men like Pardee had to be stopped. We've got to give bounties directly to enlisting men. And it was at this very moment that Buckingham, as governor, James Fry, the provost marshal general, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton came in and said to General Dix, "You can't do that. We must have recruiting agents, these brokers, get these men for us, or we never get any men at all." Wow. And I think that case speaks directly to the problem. So the problem of wage labor and how Northern leaders understood how wage labor and some of its coercive and fraudulent aspects had to be employed in order to win the war. Willett ends up running away from service. A couple months later, he is docked 6 months' pay. He comes back into the military late in the fall of 1864, only to die basically penniless in service in December of disease. So you can see, like in that one case, like and I talked about consent being important, and this guy in some way consented to this and revoked his consent, and then was duped into making a new and much less advantageous bargain that ultimately led to his death.
Wow. Brian, one of the things that I thought about when I was reading through your book was a phrase that I heard many times in my family, because I'm descended from Appalachian hog farmers. So they were just people who either volunteered or were drafted in the First World War. It's always been rich man's war, poor man's fight. And I know that William Marvel touched on this in his book about Lincoln's Mercenaries. And I'm wondering, touching on that paradox of Union men fighting against Southern aristocracy, but yet they're still under the control of this overarching institution over top of them. And then the institution tells you, well, you can get out of it, but you need to have so much money to do so. And I kept thinking about that again and again when I was going through your book. And of course, you touched on, you talked a lot about that in the book. It's kind of like the elephant in the room with the conversation that we're having, is like the bounty system as far as getting yourself out of service in 1863 and post 1863. How do you think that idea of rich man's war, poor man's fight, because of the bounty issue, may have taken its effect on either the service of others, or men deserting, or something to that effect?
Yeah, that's a good question, John. A couple things. I guess we need to define some things. Part of the Enrollment Act that was passed in March of 1863 by the U.S. Congress, that was the draft. It created different classes of men and put them in rank order to be drafted if communities did not meet their quota. And so the first thing to say is that communities could enlist enough men to meet their quota through other means. One of the means they took is by collecting higher taxes to raise bounty funds locally through bond issues and other ways to raise the money necessary to recruit, to encourage volunteers to enlist, so that there wouldn't be a draft in their community. But the draft also had a clause called the Commutation Clause, which offered drafted men the opportunity to pay $300 to avoid service. They would pay that to the government. They could also hire a substitute to serve in their place. The justification behind the Commutation Act, and this goes straight up to President Lincoln, was that setting the commutation fee where it was stopped a kind of a more free and chaotic market in substitutes. So if you set a commutation fee at $300, you would never pay a substitute more than that, right? So there was an economic reason for that. Of course, the criticism came from those who didn't have $300 and friends of people who didn't have $300, and that's where the concern about this being a rich man's war and poor man's fight on the northern side, I think came from. I think you'd probably hear that phrase a bit more in the South, but in the North, I guess what we're talking about, a day laborer in New York City, say, is still making $1 a day and probably making maybe $200 a year in seasonal work. dry goods clerk might make $500 or $600 or $800 a year. So there's a range, and so this commutation fee could look differently depending on which perspective you were coming at it from, depending on what your occupation was, what your family savings were.
Mm-hmm.
So this certainly did create inequities. I guess what I'd say about William Marvel's Lincoln's Mercenaries is it's based upon really impressive census research. Marvel has done a lot of really painstaking work in sources that list occupation and personal and real estate, but other than that, don't really tell you a lot. So he's really mined a lot of interesting information, and to make the argument that in fact it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. You see a lot of men on the lower income scales enlisting from the beginning. I guess I would say though that he often treats people with similar amounts of capital, kind of defined here by the census tallies of personal estate and real estate, the same, even though their occupational sort of aspirations may be completely different. So he ends up, I think, treating textile workers working on looms and so on and so forth in mill towns in New England the same as an urban dry good clerk who might want to, in the future, if he can, become an independent businessman, who might be very wealthy and who might have wealthy parents, for instance. So I think, the way I come down on this question is I think it's a war that for Northerners seemed to be a war in which they could become rich because the war revealed that other Americans were poor. And so it's about class for sure, but it's about a Northern middle class trying to succeed in their own revolution against slavery's capital, even if that means taking advantage of vulnerable workers, both North and South. Let me pause there and let you interject, but I know I haven't quite answered all of your question yet, John.
Oh no, I was wondering about that, the whole bounty system, and you're right that I have heard it from a lot of Confederate memoirs and diaries and such, where they'll say, well, we don't have this many slaves, I can't get out of this service, right, or whatever. And they were, of course, the first to have a draft,
right?
And that caused that discrepancy, and that I don't know, possibly I'd have to ask Pete too, that possibly leads to desertion rates and such as well because of it. And it'd be a really interesting comparative thing to see if that also leads to the same in the Northern Army.
So the thing that changes in the middle of 1864 is the Commutation Act, because of all this criticism against it, is repealed, and that creates a market in substitutes where drafted men would have to pay, let's say, over the moon for a substitute. Yeah. And that leads to the development of this class of labor brokers called substitute or bounty brokers, who declare for drafted men and men who might want to serve as substitutes that they have information for drafted men and those who want to be hired in an anonymous system of labor. So you have, I gave you guys one of the letters of one of those bounty brokers to post, in which he refers to men is cheap here today, where I get the title for my book. These men regularly linked rural people with urban people in the West and East. They peddled substitutes, surgeon and recruiter to surgeon and recruiter, until they could get them into the service. They employed bounty jumpers, and with the understanding that they would receive the lion's share of the cut. So certainly there is a problem of men collecting bounty, absconding, and then enlisting again for another bounty. My research shows that a lot of those men were employed by these brokers. And so even that relationship wasn't just about the ambitions of individual soldiers, but they were kind of employed by the brokers themselves. And I haven't even, so these substitute brokers would misrepresent the men they brought for enlistment. They would use paper credits that had men's names on papers, but didn't really correspond with any living human being. And so they were enlisting people just on paper. And so they were cheating town commissioners who were coming into big cities like New York and Brooklyn, trying to fill their community's quotas. And of course, they were also getting men drunk and enlisting them and stealing the lion's share of their bounties before they could sober up.
Wow.
Well, Brian, I think the other thing that you've pointed to is it's human trafficking that's occurring, right, with these labor brokers. I mean, it's human trafficking, something again that we often don't think about when we reflect upon the Northern War effort. And I think that's again what your book has done so brilliantly for us, is that it opens up these what you might call sort of underground economies. And it's a point that John and I that we have touched on with a number of other of our guests, is that the original scholarship that you've done, it can only be done by going into the archives. And we've talked about some of the differences between scholarly work and work that's more for a public audience. I mean, this book, Men is Cheap, it does it both. It advances our knowledge, it builds upon the historiography, it challenges the historiography, but it does it in such a way that you see, thanks to Brian's, I think, very skillful writing, you see historical actors at work and doing things. And so they are stories that people, the reader, can connect with. But at the end of the day, this book can only be done if you do the back-breaking research that's going into the archives. How many years, Brian, did it take for you to do the research for this book? How many?
A long time. I mean, it took me 10 years from kind of conceiving of it as a book about soldiers' economies, and melding it, bringing it together with another project on an institution called the Intelligence Office, the place where antebellum employers and employees went to find information about the labor market. And so it took many years of research and then writing to bring it all together.
Well, Brian, our time is nearing an end here. And so again, thank you so much for coming this evening, and remind our viewers that if you go to the University of North Carolina Press's homepage, right, UNC, look it up. You'll of course find Brian's book. You'll find other books in the Civil War America series. And John has that code for us. I can say it as well. 01D AH40. You put in that code, you'll get 40% off of Brian's book. Brian, again, thank you so much. John, I don't know.
Sure.
Any final words here before we part?
Oh, I just wanted to let everyone know again that information about the book and the 40% off is in the description above. And I'm sorry that we didn't get deeper into the intelligence offices, because I felt like that one time when I had to go seeking a job and I had to go to a place where I'm like, oh, you're going to plug me into a warehouse. Okay, that's fine. It's something,
Sure.
Yeah. But no, it was a fantastic read. And luckily I got the box of books last night at 10 o'clock at night, and almost pulled an all-nighter to read through it. So, but it was a great book. And I did a short video on Instagram for you as well, Brian, to try to plug it.
Thank you.
But
Thank
yeah,
you both very much.
yeah, absolutely. And all the information's in the description for you all watching. And Brian, I really appreciated everything you had to say here tonight. And you've opened some eyes in the comments, so we're going to have to go through those later and check
Yeah.
those out.
Okay.
And
Sounds
John,
good.
John, we have on Tuesday, we have Beth Parnitska. Beth Parnitska is Chief of Interpretation at Appomattox Courthouse, and she is also a student of Brian's. She was a student of mine as well
Yeah.
when I was at WVU. So she's going to talk to us, of course, about Appomattox, being the head of interpretation at Appomattox, how interpretations have evolved over time. And finally, I'm sure she'll have some interesting observations about what's the future being a national park at the time of a pandemic, and how are they going to start opening up to the general audience. So Beth Parnitska on Monday night at 7 o'clock.
Yeah. So thank you again, Brian, for being on. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Pete, for being a part of the conversation. And thank you all in the comments. We'll get to them here soon. I got through some of them. I was looking over here because I got a brand new screen now, and I'm looking over here and watching the comments. We got to get back through this. But thank you all for tuning in tonight. Appreciate it. We'll see you on Monday evening.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Pete.
Take care, man.